On August 21, 2022, an ITA Airways flight carrying 166 passengers from New York to Rome overshot its destination by nearly 30 miles. Air traffic controllers tried to make contact. Nothing. They tried again. Silence. For over 10 minutes, the Airbus A330 sailed past its designated approach path, while controllers on the ground watched, increasingly alarmed, as the aircraft failed to respond to repeated radio calls. When the pilots finally answered, their voices carried that unmistakable groggy quality of people who'd just woken up. Both of them had been asleep. This wasn't an isolated incident. That same year, an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 flew past Addis Ababa's airport at cruise altitude. Autopilot engaged, pilots unconscious. In 2019, 2 Air India pilots were suspended after both fell asleep during a flight from Delhi to London, missing air traffic control calls for nearly half an hour while their plane flew over European airspace carrying 166 people. Go back to 2009, and you'll find a Northwest Airlines flight that overshot Minneapolis by 150 miles because both pilots were absorbed in their laptops. Though they claimed they weren't sleeping, the effect was functionally identical. The pattern reveals something deeply uncomfortable about modern aviation. We've built aircraft so automated, so capable of flying themselves, that they've created the conditions for the very people meant to monitor them to zone out completely. Think about it like this. You're sitting in a cockpit where the plane is doing everything. It's maintaining altitude, following its programmed route, adjusting for winds, communicating with satellites for navigation. The hum of the engines is constant. The cockpit is warm. You've been awake since 3 in the morning for this transatlantic flight. The other pilot is equally exhausted, and there's nothing requiring your immediate attention. What happens next isn't a failure of character or professionalism. It's a collision between human biology and technological capability. The aviation industry has a term for what modern pilots do most of the time: systems monitoring. On a typical commercial flight from London to Singapore, the pilots might actively hand-fly the aircraft for a total of 6 minutes. 3 minutes after takeoff, 3 minutes before landing. The rest of those 13 hours? They're watching the automation work. Their primary job isn't flying the plane in the traditional sense. It's making sure the computers flying the plane don't make mistakes and being ready to intervene if something goes wrong. This is simultaneously the safest way to operate aircraft and, paradoxically, one of the most cognitively challenging. Human factors researchers call it the paradox of automation. As machines become more reliable, the humans monitoring them must remain vigilant for increasingly rare failures, which is something our brains are spectacularly bad at. Studies from the University of Illinois found that after just 30 minutes of monitoring an automated system, human attention begins to waver significantly. After an hour, our ability to detect anomalies drops by nearly 40%. Now extend that to a 12-hour flight where nothing goes wrong, and you're asking human beings to do something fundamentally opposed to how our attention systems evolved. But pilot fatigue isn't just about boredom or automation complacency. The reality is more complex and, frankly, quite sobering for anyone who flies regularly. Commercial pilots operate under scheduling systems that routinely have them crossing multiple time zones, working irregular hours, and getting inadequate sleep between flights. A NASA study tracking pilot fatigue found that during long-haul flights, pilots averaged only 4.8 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period, well below the 7 to 9 hours recommended for optimal cognitive function. European aviation safety regulators conducted research showing that pilot fatigue contributes to between 15 and 20% of aviation accidents and serious incidents. The math gets worse when you look at circadian disruption. A pilot might finish a flight landing in Dubai at 2 a.m. local time, which is 7 p.m. in their home time zone. They're supposed to rest, but their body thinks it's early evening. 12 hours later, they're flying again. Except now, their circadian rhythm is completely confused about whether they should be alert or asleep. Layer on top of this the cabin environment itself. Commercial aircraft typically cruise at a cabin altitude equivalent to about 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. At that altitude, oxygen saturation in your blood drops, and even mild hypoxia causes drowsiness and impaired judgment. The cockpit stays warm because cold cabins lead to passenger complaints. But warmth is a powerful sleep trigger for an already exhausted brain. So, both pilots fall asleep. What actually happens? Here's what's really going on while they're unconscious. Absolutely nothing changes from a flight path perspective, at least initially. Modern autopilot systems are astonishingly sophisticated. They're not just holding the nose level and the wings straight. The flight management system has the entire route programmed. Every waypoint, every altitude change, every turn. It's receiving continuous updates from GPS satellites, cross-referencing with inertial navigation systems, and making constant micro-adjustments for wind, air pressure, and temperature. If the flight plan says to turn left at a specific coordinate and descend to a new altitude, the autopilot will do exactly that without any human input whatsoever. The plane will follow its programmed path with mechanical precision. It will maintain the assigned altitude within a few feet. It will execute turns at the exact coordinates specified. If it encounters turbulence, newer systems will even adjust control surfaces to smooth out the ride. In many ways, the aircraft is more consistent and precise than a human pilot would be during this phase of flight. The autopilot doesn't get distracted, doesn't have lapses in attention, doesn't mishear a radio call. It just flies. But there's one problem with this seemingly perfect automation, and it's a big one. The autopilot doesn't know what it doesn't know. It can't recognize that a storm system has developed along the route. It can't respond when air traffic control issues a new instruction to change altitude because of conflicting traffic. It can't notice that the aircraft is approaching the boundary of one controller's airspace and needs to switch radio frequencies. Most critically, it can't make the decision to deviate from the plan when the plan becomes unsafe. This is where things can go from concerning to dangerous very quickly. Air traffic control manages thousands of flights daily by maintaining separation, vertical, horizontal, or both, between aircraft. This requires constant communication and coordination. Controllers issue instructions: descend and maintain flight level 330, or turn left heading 270 for traffic. These aren't suggestions. They're commands that must be acknowledged and executed promptly. When a plane doesn't respond, controllers have a serious problem. They can't be certain whether it's a radio failure, a crew emergency, or something worse. They have to assume the aircraft is essentially uncontrolled and start moving other traffic out of its path. The Ethiopian Airlines incident in 2022 illustrates this perfectly. The Boeing 737 was supposed to begin its descent into Addis Ababa, but when controllers issued the descent clearance, there was no response. They tried again. Nothing. The aircraft continued at cruise altitude, flying past the airport. The autopilot was following its last instructions perfectly: maintain altitude and track, because no one was awake to tell it otherwise. Controllers watched on radar as the plane sailed beyond the airport, eventually triggering a terrain warning system as it headed toward a higher ground. That automated alarm finally woke the pilots, who found themselves 25 miles past their destination, scrambling to understand what had happened. Now, obviously, aviation regulators know about fatigue. The rules meant to prevent pilots from falling asleep are extensive and vary by country, but they all share a common framework. Flight time limitations restrict how many hours pilots can be at the controls in a day, week, or month. Rest requirements mandate minimum hours between flights. For long-haul flights over a certain duration, airlines must carry relief pilots, extra crew members who can take over, so others can rest in designated crew rest compartments. But here's the thing about rules. They're based on averages and assumptions that don't account for individual variation. One pilot might function perfectly well on 6 hours of sleep, another needs 8. The regulations assume pilots will actually sleep during their rest periods, but try falling asleep in a hotel room in a foreign city at 3 p.m. when your body thinks it's 9 p.m. and you need to wake up in 4 hours for the return flight. The rules also can't account for personal factors. A pilot dealing with insomnia, family stress, or illness who shows up for duty technically legal but functionally exhausted. European aviation authorities conducted a fascinating survey where they asked pilots to self-report their alertness levels during flights. Nearly 60% admitted to having fallen asleep in the cockpit at some point, and of those, about 30% said they'd woken to find their co-pilot also asleep. The actual numbers are almost certainly higher because of reporting bias. Pilots are understandably reluctant to admit something that could end their careers. In the United States, the FAA took pilot fatigue seriously enough after the 2009 Colgan air crash in Buffalo, which killed 50 people, and where pilot fatigue was a contributing factor, that they completely rewrote flight and duty time regulations in 2014. The new rules were more restrictive, but airlines complained they were too expensive to implement. After legal challenges and lobbying, some provisions were relaxed. What protection does exist during these incidents comes from multiple overlapping safety systems, though calling them systems makes them sound more coordinated than they actually are. The first line of defense is simple: 2 pilots. If one falls asleep, the other should notice and either wake them up or stay alert themselves. This is why every commercial flight has at least 2 pilots, and it's why even in a quiet cruise phase, they're supposed to be periodically scanning instruments, checking weather updates, and monitoring radio calls. The assumption is that 2 independent humans won't both fail simultaneously. Except they do, because they're not actually independent. They're both tired, they're in the same warm, humming cockpit, they're both experiencing the same oxygen-reduced environment. And critically, there's a social dynamic at play. If you notice your co-pilot is drowsy and you're feeling tired yourself, there's often an unspoken agreement to both relax monitoring intensity. Neither pilot wants to be the one who seems unable to handle the job. Neither wants to report fatigue and potentially face career consequences. The second safety layer is air traffic control, which acts as an external monitor. Controllers expect check-ins at certain points, frequency changes as the aircraft moves between airspace sectors, and responses to instructions. When a plane goes silent, controllers can attempt to raise it on emergency frequencies or ask other aircraft in the area to try making contact. If that fails, military aircraft can be scrambled to visually inspect the cockpit, though this is obviously a last resort and has its own risks. But this protection only works in controlled airspace with radar coverage. Over oceans and remote areas, aircraft can fly for hours between position reports, during which time sleeping pilots might go undetected. Technology provides a third layer. Modern aircraft have systems that detect pilot inactivity. Some airlines have implemented alerting systems that require pilots to periodically press a button or move a control to confirm they're conscious. If there's no input for a set period, usually around 15 minutes, an alarm sounds in the cockpit. The problem is these systems aren't mandatory worldwide, and even where they exist, they can be disabled or ignored. There's also the risk of over-alarming. If you make the system too sensitive, it becomes an annoyance that crews circumvent. The Collision Avoidance System, officially called TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, provides another automated safety net. If 2 aircraft get too close, TCAS generates resolution advisories that tell one plane to climb and the other to descend. These commands are automatic and don't require air traffic control intervention. A sleeping crew might be jolted awake by a climb or descend. Alert if their aircraft came into conflict with another. It's a last-second prevention of mid-air collision, but it's not designed to compensate for absent pilot monitoring throughout a flight. Then there's what happens when the plane runs out of its programmed flight plan. This is where automation reaches its limits. Most autopilot systems, when they reach the final waypoint in their navigation database, will simply continue on the last heading. Some will enter a hold pattern, but none of them will land the plane automatically under normal circumstances. Auto-land systems exist and can touch down and even brake automatically, but they require specific setup by pilots, work only at equipped airports, and need certain weather conditions. They're not a substitute for conscious human decision-making during approach and landing. This means that if both pilots sleep through their destination, as happened with the ITA Airways and Ethiopian Airlines flights, the plane will eventually do something that wakes them up. It might be an alarm indicating the descent point was missed. It could be ATC calling repeatedly with increasing urgency. The plane might enter a hold pattern if that was programmed, circling the airport indefinitely. Worst case, it continues past the airport until fuel becomes critical and automated fuel warnings start sounding. Modern aircraft are extremely loud about low fuel states, specifically to ensure someone conscious responds. There's a darker historical precedent that shows what can happen when these safety layers all fail. In 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed in Greece, killing all 121 people aboard. The pilots had become incapacitated, not from sleep but from hypoxia due to a pressurization failure. The plane flew on autopilot for nearly 3 hours while everyone on board was unconscious or dead from oxygen deprivation. It circled Athens airport, burning fuel, until the engines flamed out and it crashed into a hillside. Greek Air Force fighters had scrambled and observed the incapacitated pilots through the cockpit windows, but could do nothing to save the aircraft. That incident, while different in cause, demonstrates the chilling reality of what happens when automation continues perfectly while the humans are gone. What's causing this problem to persist despite decades of aviation safety improvements? If you guessed systemic economic pressures in the airline industry combined with biological realities we can't regulate away, you'd be right. Airlines operate on incredibly thin profit margins, typically 2 to 3% in good years. Crew costs represent up to 30% of operating expenses. Every regulation that requires more pilots, more rest periods, or more restrictive scheduling cuts directly into profitability. This creates constant pressure to interpret regulations as permissively as possible and to design schedules that are technically legal but practically exhausting. Budget airlines have particularly aggressive scheduling. Ultra-long-haul flights, which are increasingly popular because passengers want non-stop service between distant cities, push crews to the absolute limits of duty time regulations. A 17-hour flight from Perth to London means pilots are awake and responsible for safety for nearly an entire waking day, even with rest breaks. The biological reality is that human performance degrades significantly over that period, no matter how many pilots you rotate through the cockpit. There's also a cultural component within aviation that makes the problem harder to address. Flying is still seen as a prestigious, desirable job. Pilots are supposed to be capable, alert, professional at all times. Admitting fatigue can be perceived as admitting weakness or unsuitability for the role. Airlines may officially encourage crews to report fatigue, but the practical reality often involves being removed from a trip without pay, getting flagged in the scheduling system, or facing questions about their fitness for duty. This creates a powerful incentive to tough it out, to show up tired and hope the other pilot is more alert, to rely on coffee and willpower rather than admitting the schedule is unsustainable. Aviation authorities have tried addressing this through fatigue risk management systems, which sound sophisticated but often amount to airlines self-monitoring and self-reporting. The data shows these systems work when properly implemented. airlines that take fatigue seriously, that adjust schedules based on actual crew feedback, that create cultures where reporting exhaustion is normalized, do see improvements. But enforcement is inconsistent, and proving that fatigue caused an incident is difficult because pilots rarely admit they were asleep unless there's irrefutable evidence. Looking at where aviation is headed, the irony is that increasing automation might actually make this problem worse before it gets better. As aircraft become more capable of flying themselves, the human role becomes even more abstract. Monitoring systems that almost never fail, staying alert for events that almost never happen. Some aviation researchers argue we're approaching a point where we should either fully commit to automation and remove pilots from the equation entirely, or deliberately make aircraft less automated to keep pilots engaged. The middle ground we're in now, where pilots are legally required but functionally redundant most of the time, creates ideal conditions for the kind of passive monitoring failure that leads to both crew members falling asleep. Single-pilot operations are being seriously considered for cargo flights and even, eventually, passenger flights. The technology exists to have one pilot with ground-based support, or even fully autonomous aircraft with remote human oversight only for emergencies. Airlines would love this for obvious cost reasons. But it raises a troubling question. If we acknowledge that two pilots can both fall asleep, what happens with just one? The answer proposed is better automation and monitoring, which brings us right back to the same paradox. Better automation enables the very inattention it's meant to protect against. For now, the system relies on multiple imperfect layers that together usually prevent catastrophe. Pilots fall asleep more often than anyone wants to admit, but they usually wake up before anything truly dangerous happens. Air traffic control catches most incidents before they escalate. Automated systems prevent collisions when human monitoring fails. The destination airport eventually forces some response, even from sleeping crew. It's not elegant, and it's certainly not what passengers imagine is happening when they board a flight. But it generally works. The next time you're at cruise altitude, reading or sleeping or watching a movie, remember that the two people in the cockpit might be doing the same. The plane is flying itself, as it's designed to do. The automation is working. But somewhere in that sophisticated chain of technology and procedure is a vulnerability we haven't fully solved. The gap between what we expect human beings to do and what they're biologically capable of doing for hours on end in an environment specifically designed to be stable, quiet, and uneventful. We've built aircraft so safe and automated that keeping the humans awake has become one of the biggest remaining challenges in aviation safety. That's either reassuring because the planes themselves are incredibly capable, or concerning because we still need human judgment in situations the automation can't handle. Probably both.